He slid the divorce papers across the marble table like he was tipping a waitress he'd never see again. Roman DeLuca didn't look up. He was already texting someone. The glow of his phone reflected off his cufflinks, off the crystal glasses, off 22 years of a marriage he'd already mentally discarded. Elena's hand didn't shake when she picked up the pen. That surprised her. She signed her name. Quietly. Carefully. The same way she'd done everything for 2 decades. Without applause, without acknowledgement, without anyone in that room understanding what was actually walking out the door. Roman finally looked up. He smiled. That wide, clean smile she used to love. I can finally live the life I deserve. Elena set the pen down, pushed a worn leather journal across the table toward him. You'll need this. He laughed, didn't even touch it. If you've ever given everything to someone who never noticed, stay with me. Because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when the invisible finally becomes undeniable. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the very end, because what comes next will leave you speechless. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Elena Marlowe married Roman de Luca, her mother pulled her aside in the back room of St. Bridget's Church and held both her hands so tight it almost hurt. You're sure? Her mother asked. Not with excitement, not with tears of joy, with the particular worry of a woman who recognized something in Roman DeLuca that her daughter, 26 years old and absolutely certain she was making the right choice, simply could not yet see. Elena smiled. I've never been more sure of anything. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they've already accepted an outcome they can't prevent. Elena didn't think about that moment again for almost 15 years. Roman de Luca was not a simple man to love. He was loud in a room even when he wasn't speaking. Broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, with a jaw like something carved rather than born, he commanded attention the way gravity commanded objects, not by asking, but simply by existing. When he walked into a restaurant, conversations quieted. When he made a decision, it was already final before the words left his mouth. The DeLuca name had meant something in Chicago for 3 generations, and Roman had expanded that meaning into something darker, wider, and considerably more dangerous than his father had ever intended. Elena had met him at a hospital fundraising gala. She was 25 and working double shifts in the neurology ward at Northwestern Memorial. She wore a dress she'd borrowed from her roommate and heels that were half a size too small, and she spent most of the evening near the back of the room, nursing a glass of sparkling water and watching the Chicago elite perform wealth at each other. Roman had walked straight to her, not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room, though she was striking. Dark hair, serious eyes, the kind of face that grew more interesting the longer you looked at it. He walked straight to her because she was the only person there who looked genuinely unimpressed by everything around her. You look like someone who'd rather be somewhere else, he said. I'm on hour 31 of a 36-hour rotation, she told him honestly. I'd rather be unconscious. He laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him. And in that unguarded second, Elena saw something behind the polished exterior that she would spend the next 2 decades trying to reach. She never quite got there, but she never stopped trying. The early years were good in the way that stories about the early years are always good when you're telling them later. Roman was generous, volatile, yes, capable of a cold fury that could empty a room in seconds, but also capable of unexpected warmth, of showing up to the hospital at midnight with food when she'd mentioned offhandedly that she'd skip dinner. He was not the kind of man who sent flowers. He was the kind of man who remembered, 3 months later, that you'd mentioned once that you loved a particular restaurant in the West Loop, and then he made a reservation and said nothing about it until you were already in the car. Elena told herself that was love, that the big gestures were in there somewhere, just expressed differently. She told herself a lot of things in those early years. The first time she found out what Roman DeLuca actually did for a living, not the real estate holdings and restaurant investments he spoke of publicly, but the infrastructure beneath all of it. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a cup of tea gone cold, watching 2 men she'd never seen before speak in hushed voices with her husband in the back garden. When they left, Roman came inside and found her watching him. The silence lasted almost 30 seconds. I should have told you before the wedding, he said finally. Yes, she agreed. You should have. Another silence. Are you going to leave? He asked, and his voice, This was the thing she remembered afterward, the detail that lodged itself under her skin. His voice carried something in it she'd never heard before, a hairline fracture of genuine fear. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Tell me everything," she said. "Right now, all of it, and then I'll decide." He told her. Not everything. She understood later that there were layers Roman DeLuca would never expose to anyone. But enough. Enough that by the time dawn came gray through the kitchen windows, Elena knew exactly the kind of man she had married and exactly the kind of life that stretched in front of her. She didn't leave. Later, when people asked why, and eventually people always ask why, she struggled to explain it in a way that didn't sound like weakness or delusion. The truth was complicated and not particularly flattering. Part of it was that she was already pregnant with their daughter, Sophia. Part of it was that she'd grown up watching her father stay in situations long past the point of wisdom, and she understood something in her bones about loyalty that didn't always make rational sense. And part of it, the part she was least comfortable admitting even to herself, was that she still believed in that hairline fracture she'd heard in his voice. She still believed something inside Roman DeLuca could be reached if she was patient enough. So she stayed. And she became something she had never planned to be. Elena had given up her nursing career 2 years into the marriage, at Roman's insistence. He didn't want his wife working hospital shifts. He wanted her available, present. He said it was about family, about Sophia needing a mother at home. Elena suspected and later confirmed that it was also about control. Roman DeLuca did not like variables he hadn't personally approved, but giving up nursing didn't mean giving up the knowledge. That knowledge lived in her hands, in the way she looked at a person's face and could read what their body was quietly doing beneath the surface. And it was that knowledge, combined with the obsessive attentiveness of a woman who had nothing left to pour herself into, that first noticed the tremor. Roman's left hand. A Tuesday morning in early October. He was reading the newspaper, coffee in one hand, and his left hand, resting on the table, moved in a tiny rhythmic shiver that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and then stopped. He didn't notice. He kept reading. Elena set down her own coffee cup very carefully and said nothing. That afternoon, she called Dr. Malcolm Reeves, a neurologist at Northwestern she'd worked under during her final year of nursing. She described what she'd seen in clinical terms, her voice precise and controlled, and listened to the long pause on the other end of the line. "Elena," Dr. Reeves said carefully, "has he mentioned any other symptoms? Fatigue, difficulty with balance, changes in his handwriting?" She thought of 3 separate moments in the last month. Roman dropping a key, Roman pausing at the top of the stairs for just a half-second longer than usual, Roman complaining twice that his pen felt different. "Yes," she said quietly, "all of those." Another pause. "You need to get him in here," Dr. Reeves said. "Soon." Getting Roman DeLuca into a doctor's office was, Elena discovered, roughly equivalent to convincing a mountain to move left on a Tuesday. He was not sick. He had never been sick. Sickness was for people without sufficient willpower to remain otherwise. He was 51 years old and had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and a business partner who'd tried to poison him, and he had not accomplished all of that by listening to his body's minor complaints. Elena did not argue. She learned early that arguing with Roman was like pushing against a current, exhausting, counterproductive, and ultimately pointless. Instead, she mentioned very casually over dinner that Dr. Reeves had called to say he was offering complimentary executive health screenings to a select group of colleagues. Roman liked being in a select group. He agreed to go, with the particular air of a man doing someone a small favor. The diagnosis came back 3 weeks later. Elena was in the room when Dr. Reeves explained it. She held Roman's hand. He let her, which told her more about his internal state than anything he would ever say out loud, and listened to words she had already suspected and spent 3 weeks hoping she was wrong about. Progressive autonomic neuropathy. Rare. Incurable. Manageable. With aggressive and consistent intervention, but manageable was doing a significant amount of heavy lifting in that sentence, because the management protocol was complex, demanding, and required the kind of vigilance that most people simply couldn't sustain. Roman listened with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on a point slightly past Dr. Reeves' left shoulder. When the doctor finished, Roman nodded once. "What do I need to do?" "Truthfully," Dr. Reeves said, You need to restructure your entire life around this condition. Roman made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. That's not possible. Then you'll need someone who can do it for you. He didn't look at Elena, she looked at him. She already knew what she was going to do. She'd known since the drive to the hospital, watching Roman's knuckles white on the steering wheel, watching him hold himself together through sheer refusal to acknowledge anything might be wrong. She'd known the way you know things you've already decided before you consciously realize you've decided them. She was going to fight this for him. Not because he asked, not because he deserved it, because she had looked at this man in a church 22 years ago. Well, 2 years before the church, but the church was when she'd committed, and something in her had made a promise that her mind was still honoring long after her heart had grown tired and complicated. The medical management of Roman DeLuca became Elena's second career, her secret career. Because the first rule she established early, instinctively, without anyone telling her, was that Roman could not know how bad it was. Not the full picture. Not the 3 a.m. crisis protocols or the emergency contacts she'd established at 4 different hospitals under a carefully constructed false identity to protect his position in the organization. Not the medication interaction chart she updated monthly that filled 12 pages and had required 3 separate neurologists, 2 cardiologists, and a pharmacologist to create. Not the twice-yearly conversations with specialists in Zurich and Houston that she coordinated through a medical consulting firm that believed they were serving a private security contractor. Roman knew he took medication. He believed he took a few things to manage some neurological symptoms. He believed his condition was inconvenient but minor. He believed this because Elena curated his medical reality the way a museum curator arranges an exhibition, carefully, deliberately, with a specific effect in mind. She did it because the alternative was Roman DeLuca losing his grip on the only identity he'd ever had. And a Roman without purpose was, she believed, a Roman who would stop fighting. And if Roman stopped fighting, the disease would take him within years, possibly months. So she fought instead, quietly, invisibly. In the way she did everything. The medication schedule alone would have broken most people. 17 different prescriptions across the span of a day, each with specific timing requirements, food interactions, contraindications. She had to cross-reference every single time she added or removed anything from the protocol. She kept the primary chart in a worn brown leather journal that she'd started the week after the diagnosis, its pages filling year by year with observations, adjustments, emergency notes written in the controlled handwriting of someone who'd learned to stay calm when her hands wanted to shake. She knew which medication caused his blood pressure to drop if he'd eaten anything acidic in the 2 hours prior. She knew the precise dosage adjustment required when his weight fluctuated more than 7 pounds. She knew that on mornings when his voice was hoarser than usual, a symptom Roman himself never noticed, she had to double-check his overnight oxygen levels and, 3 times in 12 years, had caught early warning signs of respiratory distress that she quietly managed before they became emergencies. 3 times. She stopped him from dying 3 times and he never knew. He called her work a wife's duty, not meanly, necessarily, not with deliberate cruelty, with the easy dismissiveness of a man who had never been required to examine his own assumptions because no one had ever survived long enough in his orbit to hold him accountable for them. Elena was there. Elena handled things. Things got handled. The logic was, to Roman, both simple and complete. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table after midnight, his medication prepared and labeled for the morning, and felt something so heavy and precise inside her chest that she didn't have a name for it. It wasn't hatred. She'd examined that question honestly enough to be certain. It was something closer to grief, the specific grief of watching yourself become invisible to someone who once looked at you like you were the most interesting person in the room. She still remembered that gala. She still remembered the way he'd laughed, surprised out of himself. She wondered sometimes when exactly that version of him had gone underground, whether it was still there somewhere, or whether she'd simply been wrong about what she'd seen. Sophia grew up and went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, something Elena accepted with a complicated pride, understanding exactly where her daughter had absorbed that particular calling. Sophia called every Sunday and worried with the quiet intensity of a woman who understood more than she said. She worried about her father's health, yes, but the calls always ended the same way. "Are you okay, Mom?" "Not Dad. You." And Elena always said yes, because she genuinely didn't know how to answer any other way. Okay had become a very elastic concept over 22 years. The first time Elena saw Vivian Cross was at a charity event Roman insisted she attend as his wife, one of the few remaining social obligations she fulfilled. Vivian was 38, luminously beautiful, and ran a nightclub in River North that was, Elena understood from the way certain men's eyes tracked the room when her name was mentioned, connected to business interests she wasn't meant to ask about. Vivian laughed loudly and touched Roman's arm when she spoke to him and looked at Elena with the particular expression of a woman who had already made a decision and was merely confirming it was the right one. Roman, who had not genuinely looked at Elena in years, couldn't stop looking at Vivian. Elena drove home alone that night. Roman said he had business to discuss. She sat in the car in their driveway for 7 minutes before going inside, and she knew, with the same clinical certainty with which she'd once looked at a trembling hand and understood something was wrong, exactly what was happening. She was not surprised. She was, underneath the not surprised, something she hadn't expected, profoundly, exhaustedly relieved. The next 3 months were a careful, cold dismantling. Roman was not cruel in this phase. He was simply absent, in the way he'd always been absent, except now his absence had a direction and a destination. He stopped coming home for dinner most nights. He stopped the small, occasional gestures that had held the marriage together past its natural endpoint. He moved through their shared life like someone already gone, packing boxes in his mind. He told her he wanted a divorce on a Thursday evening in March. Standing in the kitchen doorway, not sitting down, not looking at her directly, he told her he deserved to be happy, that they'd both grown in different directions, that he hoped they could be civil for Sophia's sake. Elena listened to all of it. "All right," she said. He blinked. He'd expected something else. She watched him recalibrate. "That's it?" he said. "What would you like me to say, Roman?" He didn't have an answer for that. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Elena's attorney, a methodical woman named Patricia Cho, who wore the same severe bob she'd had for 20 years and had the emotional temperature of a surgeon, advised her on the financial settlement with precision and not a single unnecessary word. Elena was entitled to significant assets. She took what she needed and left the rest. Roman's people were surprised. Roman's people were also, she noticed, relieved. She began a separate process in those 4 months that no one knew about. She contacted every hospital, every specialist, every pharmacy, every insurance coordinator, every medical contact she'd built across 22 years of managing Roman DeLuca's invisible medical infrastructure. She notified them, carefully and legally, of the change in her status. She removed herself as his medical proxy. She removed herself from his emergency contacts. She voided the authorizations she'd established under her carefully constructed consulting identity. She transferred files, the ones she was legally able to transfer, to a neutral medical management company, and she left detailed notes with Dr. Reeves about what Roman's care actually required, knowing that notes on paper were not the same as a person who had lived this knowledge for 2 decades and could act on it at 3 in the morning without thinking. She did not tell Roman she was doing any of this, not because she wanted to hurt him. And she examined that question more than once, alone at the kitchen table with the leather journal open in front of her, asking herself honestly whether what she was doing was care or calculated cruelty. She concluded, with the same clinical precision she applied to everything, that she was not doing it to punish him. She was doing it because she had spent 22 years preventing him from understanding his own reality, and she could not, in good conscience, continue to do that and simultaneously walk away. He needed to know. He needed to know what his life actually required. He was simply going to have to find out without her. On the day the divorce was finalized, she wore a gray dress and carried a black leather bag and sat across from Roman in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building in the Loop with their attorneys between them like referees. Roman was wearing the suit he saved for things he considered victories. He looked good. He looked healthy. He looked, she thought, precisely like a man who had no idea what he was walking into. He slid the papers toward her when it was time. She signed. He said the thing about living the life he deserved. She put the worn leather medical journal on the table between them. "You'll need this," she said. His eyes went to it. Something crossed his face, a flicker of something she couldn't quite read, gone before she could name it. "I don't need anyone anymore," he said. Elena picked up her bag. She didn't look at the journal again. She'd spent 3 nights in the week prior making sure it was complete. Every note updated, every medication cross-referenced, every protocol documented as clearly as she could document it. It was the most thorough thing she had ever written, and she was leaving it behind like a map for someone who didn't believe they were lost. She walked to the door. She didn't look back. Standing at the elevator, waiting for the doors to open, she became aware that her hands, steady through the signing, steady through the exchange, were now trembling very slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. The elevator came. She stepped inside. The doors closed. She stood alone in the polished metal box as it descended, watching the floor numbers fall, and she felt not triumph, not grief, not the enormous rush of freedom she distantly imagined. She felt quiet. A peculiar, heavy, terrifying quiet, like the moment after something very loud has finally stopped. She didn't know yet what that quiet would eventually become. She only knew, as the lobby doors opened and Chicago's cold March air hit her face, that for the first time in 22 years, the only person she was responsible for keeping alive was herself. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, blinking in the pale morning light. Then she started walking. Roman DeLuca did not go home after the divorce was finalized. He went to a restaurant, a good one, the kind with white tablecloths and a sommelier who recognized him and didn't ask questions. He ordered the ribeye and a bottle of something Italian that cost more than most people's car payments, and he sat alone at a table for two in the back corner and ate with the deliberate pleasure of a man celebrating. He told himself he was celebrating. The leather journal Elena had left on the conference room table sat. He'd had Marco, his driver, bring it up before they left. It sat now in the passenger seat of the car outside. Roman hadn't touched it. He'd told Marco to put it somewhere out of sight, which Marco had done without comment, because Marco had been driving Roman DeLuca for 11 years and had developed a finely tuned instinct for what questions not to ask. Roman ordered dessert, ate half of it, drank most of the wine. By the time he got to the penthouse, the one he'd leased 3 weeks prior on the 47th floor of a building in Streeterville, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Lake Michigan. Vivian was already there. She'd decorated. There were flowers on the kitchen island, something from a high-end florist, and a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket, and she was wearing a red dress that cost approximately what Elena had spent on Roman's medications in a single average month, though Roman did not know that and would not have found the comparison useful. "There he is," Vivian said, and her voice did the thing it always did, warm and low, with just enough smoke in it to feel like an invitation. She crossed the room and put both hands on his chest and tilted her face up toward his. "Free man." "Free man," Roman agreed. He kissed her. He drank the champagne. He stood at the window with her and looked out at the lake going dark under a March sky. And he searched himself honestly for what he felt and found something clean and wide and uncomplicated, or at least something that resembled those things convincingly enough. Vivian talked. She was good at talking, animated, funny, full of stories about the club and the people who came through it, the kind of stories that required no response beyond occasional laughter. Roman liked that about her. Elena had been a listener. Vivian was a talker. He found, standing at that window, that what he'd wanted for years without naming it was precisely this, a woman who filled the silence rather than inhabiting it. He went to bed that night feeling something he would have described, if pressed, as happy. He woke at 2 a.m. with his heart doing something wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the crushing, chest-clutching wrongness of a heart attack in a movie. Just arrhythmic. A stuttering, offbeat pattern that lasted maybe 40 seconds and left him sitting up in the dark with sweat cooling on his back and a strange metallic taste in his mouth. Vivian slept on. Roman sat at the edge of the bed and breathed and waited for his heart to find its rhythm again. It did. Gradually, reluctantly, like an engine catching in cold weather. He sat there for a while longer than necessary. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, and stood at the window looking at the black lake. He didn't call anyone. He'd had episodes like this before, occasionally. He'd mentioned them to Elena once, years ago, and she'd made a face he hadn't fully understood and then spent the next 40 minutes asking him very specific questions that he'd found irritating and answered incompletely. After that, she'd adjusted something in his evening routine, something to do with the timing of one of his medications, he thought, though he couldn't have said which one, and the episodes had become less frequent. He told himself this one was stress. Transition. His body processing change. He went back to bed at 3 a.m. and slept until 7. By morning, he'd forgotten about it entirely. The pharmacy issue started on a Wednesday, 9 days after the divorce. Roman had sent Marco to pick up his monthly prescriptions, a task that had always been seamless, handled with the quiet efficiency of a system he'd never had to think about. Marco came back to the penthouse without the medications, and with an expression Roman recognized as the specific look his people wore when delivering news they'd rather not deliver. They said there's a problem with the authorization, Marco told him. What authorization? The pharmacy says the insurance authorization on file expired and they need a new one from… Marco checked the paper in his hand. From the primary account holder's medical proxy or authorized care coordinator. Roman stared at him. I'm the primary account holder. Yes, sir. They said you can reauthorize, but you'll need to provide updated documentation from your physician confirming current treatment protocol, plus a signed release from your previous care coordinator removing their authorization before they can transfer primary management to you directly. The silence in the penthouse living room lasted several seconds. Call the insurance company, Roman said. Marco called the insurance company. The insurance company confirmed what the pharmacy had said and added several additional requirements involving forms Roman had never heard of, signatures from treating physicians across multiple specialties, and a processing window of, at minimum, 3 to 5 business days, possibly up to 2 weeks if additional verification was required. Roman took the phone from Marco and handled it himself. He was calm for approximately 4 minutes. Then he was not calm. The woman on the other end of the line was professional and unmovable in the way of people who understand that the anger of the person they're speaking to is entirely irrelevant to the system they're operating within, and Roman DeLuca, who had not encountered a system that didn't yield to him in longer than he could remember, found this profoundly disorienting. He hung up. He looked at Marco. Get Dr. Reeves on the phone. Dr. Reeves's office called back within the hour. His assistant, a young man with a careful voice, explained that Dr. Reeves was available to see Mr. DeLuca at his earliest convenience, and that the office was aware of the insurance authorization situation, and that there were several matters Dr. Reeves had been hoping to discuss in person. What matters? Roman asked. Dr. Reeves would prefer to discuss them at the appointment, sir. Roman made the appointment for the following morning and spent the rest of the day irritated in the way he was irritated when administrative incompetence got between him and what he wanted. It didn't occur to him to be frightened. Administrative incompetence was beneath fear. That evening, Vivian made dinner. She was a capable cook in the uncomplicated way of someone who'd learned to do it for pleasure rather than necessity. She made pasta with a sauce from scratch, and she poured wine, and she talked about plans she had for the club's summer season, a renovation she was considering, a DJ she was trying to book from New York. Roman ate and listened and gave the appropriate responses, but something underneath the evening had a different texture than it had 9 days ago. He found himself looking at Vivian's hands when she gestured, graceful, unmarked hands, rings on 2 fingers, nail polish that probably had a name like Midnight Suede or something he'd never be able to identify, and thinking, without meaning to, about Elena's hands. About the way Elena's hands looked at the end of a long day, when she'd been at whatever she spent her days doing, which he had never paid sufficient attention to understand. Roman, Vivian said. He looked up. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite amused and not quite concerned. You're somewhere else entirely, she said. Just thinking about tomorrow, he said. Doctor's appointment. You have a doctor's appointment? Routine thing. She looked at him a moment longer than the reassurance warranted, then picked up her wine glass and moved on. Roman noted the look and filed it without examining it. Dr. Reeves's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Gold Coast that smelled like money and restraint. Roman had been here before, but rarely. Most of his medical interactions over the years had taken place through Elena's intermediary arrangements, and he realized now, sitting in the waiting room, that he couldn't have said with certainty how many times he'd actually sat in this specific room. A nurse took his vitals. His blood pressure was high. Not alarmingly, but higher than it should have been. And she made a note without commenting on it, which somehow bothered him more than a comment would have. Dr. Reeves came in and shook his hand and sat across from him and looked at him the way doctors look at patients when they are organizing their thoughts into an order that won't cause immediate panic. Malcolm Reeves was in his late 60s, a trim, gray-bearded man who'd been Roman's neurologist for over a decade, without, Roman now recognized, Roman ever having particularly engaged with what that relationship contained. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago that urgency was counterproductive. He placed Elena's leather journal on the desk between them. Roman looked at it. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "Elena dropped it off 2 weeks ago," Dr. Reeves said. "She also provided me with a substantial volume of documentation I need to walk you through, and I want to be direct with you about why." "She gave you my medical records." "She gave me records that she maintained," Dr. Reeves said carefully, "which is a distinction worth understanding." Roman's jaw tightened. "Those are my records." "Some of them are." Reeves opened the journal. He turned it so Roman could see the first page. Dense, handwritten notes in Elena's controlled, precise script, dated 22 years ago, almost to the month. "Some of them are records of your medical history as observed and managed by your wife over 2 decades. And some of them," he turned several pages to a section where the notes became more frequent, the margins more crowded, "document interventions that, frankly, I was not fully aware she was coordinating." Roman said nothing. He was looking at the pages, at the handwriting he recognized from grocery lists and school forms, and the notes she used to leave on the kitchen counter, and something was happening in his chest that was not a cardiac arrhythmia, but felt equally destabilizing. "Roman," Dr. Reeves said, "I need you to understand something clearly. Your condition, the progression we've been managing, is not what you believe it to be." Roman looked up. "What do I believe it to be?" "You've described it, in the appointments we've had, as a minor neurological issue. Background noise. Something that requires some medication but doesn't meaningfully affect your function." "That's what it is." Dr. Reeves took off his glasses and set them on the desk. He did this slowly, deliberately, in the manner of a man preparing to say something that requires his full face to be visible. "It is not," he said. "What you have required for the last 19 years is a level of medical management that most patients with your diagnosis receive inside a monitored care facility. Elena was doing that work at home, in real time, without clinical infrastructure, because the alternative, fully informing you of the severity of your condition, was something she judged, correctly in my opinion, would cause you to disengage from the management protocol entirely." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than Roman DeLuca was accustomed to producing. He produced silences as a power tool, calculated and deployed. This one arrived without his permission. "She was hiding it from me," he said. "She was protecting you," Reeves said. "You can call that hiding if you prefer, but I'd ask you to look at the results before you decide what to call it." He turned to a page near the middle of the journal. He pointed to a date 12 years ago, March 4th. Elena's handwriting noted vital signs, a medication adjustment, and then, in slightly different pen, as though she'd come back to add it later, 3 words: "He doesn't know." Across the bottom of the same page, in smaller letters, "BP stabilized, 2:40 a.m. He was sleeping. Good." Roman stared at those words. "What happened that night?" he asked. His voice came out lower than he intended. "Based on the notes, your blood pressure dropped to a level that, without intervention, could have precipitated a cardiovascular event," Reeves said. "She caught it, adjusted your medication, monitored you through the night, and had you stable before you woke up." Roman turned another page. Another date. Another crisis, documented in the same controlled hand. Then another. He turned the pages slowly, and each one was the same. Symptoms noted, interventions made, outcomes recorded, and in the spaces between the clinical observations, the small human evidence of a woman doing this alone, at night, without acknowledgement. A note that said called Dr. K in Houston. Adjusted protocol per his guidance with a phone number Roman didn't recognize. A note that said Sophia asking questions, told her dad is fine. He is fine, he has to be. He stopped turning. "How many times?" he started, and then stopped, because his voice had done something he didn't like. "In the journal," Reeves said, "I count 3 instances where her intervention was likely the difference between a manageable episode and a fatality. There may be others I haven't fully interpreted yet." Roman put his hand flat on the page he'd stopped at, pressed it down. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," Reeves said, and there was something in his voice, not unkind, but absolutely without give. The system she built around you has been dismantled. She removed herself legally and completely, and without a care coordinator who understands your full protocol. Not the simplified version you knew about, the actual protocol. You are managing a condition you don't understand with medications. You've never had to organize yourself, and I need you to understand what that means going forward. Roman sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked back at Reeves. "Tell me what I need," he said, "to manage this myself." Dr. Reeves opened a folder. He began listing things. Specialists, timing requirements, monitoring equipment, the medication interaction chart. He slid a printed version across the desk, 12 pages, cross-referenced and color-coded, the distilled result of what Elena had built over 2 decades. And Roman looked at it and felt something he had not felt since he was 8 years old, standing in a hospital corridor being told something he was too young to process. He felt completely in over his head. He didn't say that. He took the folder. He asked 3 questions in the voice he used when he was taking control of situations. He shook Reeves' hand. He walked out through the waiting room with his back straight and his face arranged. In the elevator, he stood alone and looked at the floor numbers and breathed. The medication costs without Elena's insurance architecture were the next discovery. Roman had people, financial people, accountants, risk managers, and he sent one of them to work through the insurance situation, assuming it was a matter of the right calls being made to the right people. His financial manager, a 50-year-old woman named Diane, who had worked for the DeLuca organization for 15 years and had the demeanor of someone perpetually bracing for impact, called him on a Friday afternoon with the results. Monthly out-of-pocket, without the existing prior authorizations, she said, comes out to between $42,000 and $58,000, depending on which tier of specialist care you're accessing and whether— "Stop," Roman said. She stopped. "Say the first number again." $42,000, minimum. He was quiet for 4 seconds. "How was it before?" Diane was quiet in a way that communicated she had already looked into this. The insurance structure that was in place, the one that's now been removed, covered 93% of those costs. Your out-of-pocket was under $1,000 a month. How was that structure set up? Another pause. Longer. It was set up through a medical consulting entity that designated you as a dependent beneficiary under a group policy. The controlling account was in Elena's name. Roman set his phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment looking at nothing in particular. $42,000 a month. Minimum. For the rest of his life. Against a fortune that was, admittedly, considerable, but which also supported an organization, properties, obligations, people. Against a fortune that was not, it turned out, as bottomless as he had always managed to believe. Vivienne found him still standing at the kitchen counter when she came in from the club at midnight. "You're in the dark," she said, and turned on the under-cabinet lights. "I know." She set down her bag and looked at him. In the 2.5 weeks they'd been living together, she had developed a particular look for moments when Roman's mood had a weight to it she couldn't identify. A focused, slightly cautious attention, like someone trying to determine whether a sound they heard in the house was significant. "How was the doctor?" she asked. He told her it was routine. He could still tell her it was routine. He looked at her across the kitchen island, her jacket still on, mascara that had done a long night's work. The particular aliveness of a woman who had just come from her own world and hadn't fully arrived in his yet. And he made a decision, not entirely conscious, not calculated. It came out of whatever was sitting in his chest since he'd left Reeves's office. "It's not routine," he said. She was still. "The condition I have," he said, it requires more management than I understood." He stopped, started again. "Elena was handling things, medical things. I didn't know the extent of it, and now it's not in place anymore." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. "How serious is it?" "Serious," he said. He hadn't said that word out loud before. It tasted wrong. "There are medications, a lot of them, costs, coordination." "How much coordination?" she asked. Her voice was measured, professional almost. He noticed that. "Daily," he said. "Apparently." Vivienne's eyes moved, just slightly, a micro-adjustment of her gaze, the way a compass needle moves. She looked at the kitchen counter, at his hands, back at his face. Daily coordination, she repeated. Yes. She took off her jacket, folded it over the back of the stool, picked up her bag again. I need some water, she said, and moved to the refrigerator. Roman watched her. Something in the way she moved had changed. Not dramatically, not even consciously, he suspected. But the slight alteration in her body language was the same thing he'd spent 30 years learning to read in rooms full of dangerous men. A person recalculating. A person revising the situation they believed they were in. He said nothing. She brought her water to the island and stood across from him and looked at him with something he could not quite name because he was not practiced in reading it. It was not cruelty. It was not even coldness. It was a kind of honest, reluctant assessment that, coming from Vivian Cross, who he had understood as entirely warm and entirely uncomplicated, frightened him more than the cold fury of a rival. Roman, she said carefully, what does daily coordination look like? Medications, monitoring, some equipment, I think, appointments. Who does that? He looked at her. I mean, who does that now, she said. You're saying Elena did it. So who? I don't know yet. Another micro shift. She took a drink of her water. Okay, she said. Not we'll figure it out. Not I'm here. Just, okay. Flat and contained, the way people say okay when they are processing information they haven't decided what to do with. Roman went to bed that night before she did and lay in the dark with his hands on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, counting the rhythm, waiting to see if it would do the wrong thing again. It didn't. Not that night. But he lay awake until almost 4 in the morning, and in the quiet of the penthouse, the lake sounds far below, Vivian's distant movements in the other room, he thought about the journal on his nightstand. He'd brought it from the conference room in the car, then from the car to Reeves's office, then back to the penthouse, carrying it without reading it, the way you carry something you know contains information you're not ready for. He picked it up. In the dark, by the pale light coming off the lake. He opened it to the first page. Elena's handwriting. The first entry dated almost 22 years ago, 2 months after the diagnosis. Small, precise letters. R. Experienced significant autonomic episode at 11:40 p.m. Duration approximately 4 minutes. Did not wake him. Adjusted morning medication per Dr. R's standing protocol. Will monitor. He read the next entry. And the next. He read for 40 minutes, turning pages carefully, as though the paper itself were something that might break. The entries were not dramatic. That was the thing about them. They were not the writing of a woman performing sacrifice or documenting her own suffering. They were functional, clinical, the record of someone doing a job, carefully, without audience, which was somehow worse than drama would have been. He was on page 63, a Tuesday in the 8th year of their marriage, a night she'd caught an early warning sign he still couldn't fully interpret, but that she had clearly recognized as serious, given the 3 calls she'd made after midnight, when he heard the bedroom door open. Vivian came in. She'd changed into pajamas. She moved to her side of the bed and got in without a word, and the silence between them was different now than it had been at midnight. It had weight and edges. You're reading it, she said. Yes. The journal she left. Yes. Vivian was quiet. Then, what's in it? Roman set the journal on his chest, looked at the ceiling. 22 years of someone making sure I didn't die, he said. The silence that followed lasted a very long time, long enough that Roman thought Vivian might have fallen asleep. Then she said quietly, into the dark, I didn't know you were that sick. 3 words in that sentence were wrong, or at least insufficient. Roman identified them without speaking. That sick implied a range of sickness at the lower end of which you were not particularly sick. Roman was not at the lower end. I didn't know either, he said. How did you not know? He didn't answer. Because the answer, that someone had loved him enough and known him well enough to understand that the knowledge would destroy something essential in him and had carried it alone rather than let that happen, was an answer he could not yet say out loud. It was too large and too late, and too specifically shaped like the outline of everything he'd thrown away. Vivian's breathing changed. She was asleep within minutes. Roman lay awake until the gray light of morning came through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And somewhere out over the lake, a decision was forming in him that he couldn't fully see yet, the way weather forms offshore, present and moving, not yet arrived. He called Diane at 8:15 a.m. sharp. "I need you to find someone," he said. "A medical care coordinator, the best available, whatever it costs." "I've already started looking," Diane said, which told him she'd anticipated this call, which told him she understood the situation better than he'd given her credit for. The issue is that what Elena provided wasn't just coordination, it was institutional knowledge. She knew your case. A new coordinator starts from scratch. "How long to get to functional?" A pause. "Months," Diane said. "Minimum, possibly longer." Roman said nothing. "Mr. DeLuca," Diane said with the careful precision of someone delivering a brick through a window, "I'd also advise you to know that the medication management in the interim is going to require your direct involvement. The interaction chart Dr. Reeves provided, someone needs to be administering that actively." "I'll handle it." "The chart is 12 pages, Diane said. "I said I'll handle it." He hung up. He went to the kitchen. He opened the cabinet where Marco had organized the medications that had been delivered the day before, the ones that could be released, the ones cleared through the first wave of insurance authorizations, a partial list that covered perhaps 60% of what he actually needed. He stood looking at them for a long time. 17 bottles, different colors, different labels, some with specific timing instructions, some with food requirements, 2 with warnings about interactions he couldn't yet cross-reference because he didn't have the full chart memorized. He picked up the first bottle, read the label, set it down, picked up the second. His hand was trembling. Not a mild tremor, the kind Elena had first noticed over a newspaper 22 years ago. His whole right hand, the hand he'd used to sign deals, to make decisions, to command the room, shaking in the morning light of a kitchen he'd chosen because it was beautiful and because Vivian liked it, shaking above 17 bottles he didn't fully understand. He stood there for a long time. He did not hear Vivian get up. He did not hear her come into the kitchen. He only knew she was there because of the sound she made, a small, involuntary intake of breath, quickly controlled. He turned. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, in the light of a Saturday morning, looking at his hand, at the bottles, at the 12-page chart he'd spread on the counter, at the reading glasses he'd had to put on for the first time because the labels were too small without them. Her face did something complicated, something that passed through several emotions too fast for him to track, and settled into an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself, in conference rooms and back rooms and private conversations for 3 decades. It was the expression of someone doing a final calculation. "I'm going to the club," she said. "I have a meeting with the renovation contractor." "It's Saturday morning," Roman said. "He's only available today." She turned and went back to the bedroom. Roman stood at the counter and listened to the sounds of her dressing, moving through the apartment, gathering her things. The sounds of someone moving through a space efficiently. The sounds of someone who knows exactly which items belong to them and which belong to the space. The front door opened. It closed. Roman stood alone in the kitchen with the bottles and the chart and the trembling hand, and the silence that came down over the penthouse was so complete and so specific that he understood, without any more information, what it meant. She wasn't coming back. Not from the meeting, not from whatever came after the meeting. The calculation he'd watched her face perform had reached its conclusion, and the conclusion was already walking down 47 floors toward a life that did not require knowledge of medication, interaction charts, or the institutional memory of what a man's body needed at 2 o'clock in the morning. When it was trying to, Roman stood at that kitchen counter for a long time after the door closed. Not thinking, not planning, just standing, which was something he had not done in decades. Simply stood in a room with no agenda and no performance and no one watching. The bottles were still arranged in front of him. The 12-page chart was still spread across the marble. His hand had stopped shaking, which felt less like recovery and more like the specific stillness that follows something breaking. He picked up the first bottle. Read it again. Set it down. He did this with each bottle, slowly, the way a man inventories damage after a fire. Not because he expects to find something good, but because he needs to know exactly what he's working with. 17 bottles. Some twice daily. Some with food. 2 that specifically said do not take within 4 hours of each other, and one that had a separate warning card tucked under the label in Elena's handwriting, not printed, handwritten, that said, "Check BP before administering. If below 90/60, hold and call Dr. R directly." His cell is in the back of the journal. Roman stood holding that card for almost a minute. She had written that note years ago. The card was worn at the edges, slightly yellowed, the ink faded in the way of something handled many times. She had checked that card, regularly, for years. In the middle of the night, in the ordinary morning, in the spaces of a life he'd taken entirely for granted, she had picked up that card and read it and made decisions based on it that he was only now understanding had kept him vertical. He put the card down. He made coffee. He drank it standing at the window, looking out at the lake going bright under a morning he hadn't asked for, and he made himself think clearly. Roman DeLuca had survived things that had killed better men, and he had done it primarily by refusing to let reality be larger than his capacity to manage it. He applied that now, methodically, without sentiment. He needed a care coordinator. Diane was working on it. He needed the insurance authorizations cleared. His attorney was working on it. He needed to understand the medication schedule. He had the chart, and he had the journal, and he had Dr. Reeves's direct line. These were manageable problems. He was a man who managed problems. He told himself this with enough force that he almost believed it. His phone rang at 10:14 a.m. It was Marco. "Something you need to know," Marco said, which was how Marco opened every conversation that was going to be bad news. 22 years of that preamble, and Roman still hadn't found a way to make himself ready for what followed it. "Tell me." "Vivian's at the club. She's been there since 8. The contractor thing. There's no contractor meeting. I've got someone at the block. She's been on the phone the whole time outside. And she had 2 large bags in the car when she left the building." Roman closed his eyes. 1 second. 2. "Thank you," he said. "You want me to?" "No," Roman said. "Nothing." He hung up. He stood at the window with the phone in his hand and the lake doing what lakes do, regardless of what's happening to the people watching them. And he felt something he specifically did not want to feel and felt it anyway. Not rage. Not yet. Something beneath rage. Something that had no name he was willing to assign it. He went and sat on the couch. He picked up the leather journal from the coffee table where he'd left it after last night. He didn't open it. He just held it, the way people hold things that have weight they need to account for. His phone rang again at 11 o'clock a.m. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered it because he answered unknown numbers. You didn't get to where he was by letting calls go to voicemail. "Mr. DeLuca," a woman's voice, precise, unhurried. "My name is Dr. Karen Yates. I'm a neurologist at Rush University Medical Center. I'm calling because I'm the 3rd consulting physician on your case, brought in by Elena DeLuca approximately 7 years ago, and I've been asked by Dr. Reeves to reach out to you directly." Roman said nothing for a moment. "Third," he said, "there were 3 of us coordinating, Dr. Reeves, myself, and a cardiovascular specialist named Dr. Okonkwo in Houston. Elena managed the coordination between the 3 practices. We were all," a brief pause, "operating with the understanding that our communication went through her. Now that that's changed, Dr. Reeves felt it was important you knew the full picture of your care team." "I didn't know there was a care team," Roman said. Another pause, shorter this time, the pause of someone recalibrating their expectations. "I see," she said. "What do you need from me?" "What I need, Dr. Yates said carefully, is for you to come in as soon as possible for a full assessment. The last time I personally evaluated you was 14 months ago, and a lot of Elena's management decisions since then were made on the basis of observed symptoms and her own clinical judgment, which was, I want to be clear, genuinely excellent clinical judgment. But without her observations going forward, I need a new baseline." "How soon?" "Monday," she said. "If you can." "I can," he said. He wrote down the address. He hung up. He sat with the journal in his lap and stared at the lake and thought about 3 doctors. 3. For over a decade, 3 specialists had been coordinating his care, and he had walked through his life knowing about one appointment with one physician, believing that was the whole of it. He thought about the version of himself that had sat in the penthouse 3 weeks ago, drinking good wine, believing he had finally gotten everything right. He wanted to find that version of himself and shake him until something came loose. His daughter called at noon. "Dad." Sophia's voice had a quality he recognized. She'd had it since she was 12, a kind of careful steadiness that said she was containing something significant. She was a resident at Johns Hopkins now, internal medicine, and she had her mother's voice and her father's jaw, and neither of their ease with emotional territory. "I talked to Mom." "All right," Roman said. "She told me some things. About your care protocol." A pause. "Dad, I need you to tell me honestly. Did you know? Any of it?" Roman leaned back against the couch cushions. He looked at the ceiling. "No," he said. The word cost him something he didn't want to calculate. Sophia was quiet for a moment. "She was protecting you," she said. "I want you to understand that. Whatever you're feeling about it right now, I need you to understand that she was doing it to keep you alive because she knew if you understood how serious it was, I'd stop fighting it," Roman said quietly. "Yes." Sophia's voice softened slightly, just slightly. "She knew that about you." Roman closed his eyes. His daughter's voice kept going, steady and careful, laying out the medical realities with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to deliver difficult information without letting her own emotions make the conversation about her. She was good at it. Elena had probably taught her that, Roman thought. Without teaching her, that's what she was doing. "There are things I want to go over with you," Sophia said. "The medication schedule especially. I can be there. I can probably get a flight Thursday, if you don't need to come." "Dad." "Sophia." He said it gently, which was not always how he said her name. I'll be all right. I have doctors. I'm handling it." A silence on the line that communicated, clearly and without words, that she was deciding whether to push. She got this from Elena too, the ability to pick battles with a precision that felt almost tactical. "I'm calling every day," she said finally. "Don't argue with me about that." "I won't." "And Dad?" Another pause, shorter. "Call her." He said nothing. "I'm not asking you to fix it," Sophia said. "I know there's nothing to fix. She would want to know you're okay. She would still want that. That's who she is." Roman sat with the phone after the call ended and did not call Elena. He thought about calling her. He examined the thought, turned it over, considered what he would say. He could not construct a version of that call that wasn't, at its core, a man calling his ex-wife because the situation had gotten bad enough that his pride had finally folded. He understood, without fully liking what he understood, that this was not a call he had earned the right to make. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He put the phone down. He spent Sunday learning the medication chart. Not reading it, learning it. The way he'd once learned the organizational structure of every rival family in Chicago. By sheer repetition until the information lived in his hands rather than his head. He sat at the kitchen counter from 8 in the morning until past midnight with the chart spread out and the journal open to cross-reference in a legal pad where he made his own notes in his own handwriting, and he went through every medication, every interaction, every timing requirement, every contingency protocol. It was the hardest work he'd done in years. Not because the information was complex, though it was complex, but because every page of it was also, inescapably, a page of evidence. Evidence of what he hadn't known. Evidence of what someone had carried for him without being asked, and without being thanked. And without, he was beginning to understand, any serious expectation that he would ever notice. He made 3 mistakes in the Sunday morning medications. Small ones. Timing errors. Not dangerous, but errors. He caught 2 himself and missed the 3rd, which he only identified when he cross-referenced against the journal at 11 p.m., and found Elena's note from 6 years ago. This one and the evening cardiac med. Minimum 5-hour gap or BP instability overnight. He will forget this. Remind him. He will forget this. She had known. She had written instructions calibrated to his specific failures. Roman sat at the counter at 11 on a Sunday night and read those 4 words and felt them go into him at a depth that physical pain generally didn't reach. Monday morning came hard. He was at Dr. Yates' office at 8 a.m. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who looked at him the way certain women look at men who have recently learned an important lesson. Not without sympathy, but without the patience to pretend the lesson is surprising. She ran tests. She asked questions. She had the journal, or a copy of the relevant sections, and she referenced it constantly, cross-checking his current state against Elena's documented observations. The results came back in the afternoon. Roman sat across from Dr. Yates in her office, and she looked at him steadily and told him that his autonomic function had declined measurably in the past 14 months. Not dramatically. The decline was consistent with the expected progression of his condition when properly managed. But properly managed was the operative phrase, and proper management had, over the past 14 months, been increasingly approximated rather than achieved. Small gaps in the protocol, decisions Elena had made in the field, adjustments that required her specific institutional knowledge, had accumulated. The good news, Dr. Yates said, is that what Elena maintained kept you in a functional range significantly better than we'd have projected at diagnosis. The honest news is that the window for maintaining that level of function narrows as the condition progresses, and we've lost some time. How much time? Roman asked. She looked at him for a moment, not with pity, with the specific honesty of someone who believes the person across from them deserves to be treated as an adult. Time to what? She said. He understood what she meant. He nodded once. The condition is progressive, she said. What we're managing is the rate of progression and the quality of function within it. Elena's protocol kept both of those in an exceptionally good place. Going forward, we replicate that as closely as we can, and we're realistic about what replication looks like without her. What does it look like? It looks like a professional care coordinator, daily monitoring, and a significant upward adjustment in your engagement with your own management. You cannot be a passive participant in this, Mr. DeLuca. That arrangement, she paused briefly, worked because the other participant was extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily committed. That's not a combination you can simply replace. Roman said nothing for a moment. Then, what would you tell me if you were being completely honest? Not clinical. Honest. Dr. Yates sat back slightly. She considered him. I'd tell you, she said, that what you had was the medical equivalent of a master engineer maintaining a complex system in the field, without a facility, without a support team, and without the primary operator even knowing the system was as complex as it was. And I'd tell you that you cannot replicate that with hired help. You can approximate it. You can do the best available version of it. But the best available version is not the same as what you had. The drive back to the penthouse was quiet. Marco didn't try to fill the silence. He never did, and Roman had always considered this Marco's greatest professional quality. The crisis arrived on a Wednesday. Not the slow crisis, the insurance maze, the medication learning curve, the daily arithmetic of managing a body that required more maintenance than he'd ever been allowed to understand. Those were ongoing. The Wednesday crisis was specific and fast, and arrived without warning the way the worst things do. It started as a headache at around 3 p.m. Roman noted it, took what he thought was the appropriate response medication, and kept working. He was on the phone with his attorney about a property transfer, standing at the window, watching a container ship move across the lake. At 3:47 p.m., his vision went strange. Not dark. Strange. The edges of things softened and shifted, the container ship becoming slightly multiple, and his left hand went to the window glass, and he leaned against it because his balance had done something unexpected. He got off the phone. He went to the couch. He sat down. He reached for the journal. The relevant page took him 3 minutes to find because his hands weren't cooperating fully, and his vision made the handwriting harder to parse than it should have been. When he found it, he read the entry twice before he understood it. Visual disturbance accompanied by balance disruption, not migraine protocol. This is autonomic, likely BP event. Check BP immediately. If systolic below 85, call Dr. R. Do not take the headache medication. It will make it worse. He'd already taken the headache medication. He found his blood pressure cuff. Elena had left it in the emergency kit she'd assembled, which Marco had brought over at Roman's request, without Roman fully understanding why he'd requested it until now. He put it on his arm with hands that weren't steady. The machine ran its cycle. The numbers appeared, 78/51. He stared at those numbers for a moment. He knew enough by now to know what they meant. He called Dr. Reeves. Reeves answered on the second ring, which told Roman that Reeves had been expecting a call like this. "What did you take?" Reeves asked, after Roman read him the numbers. Roman told him. A brief silence. How long ago? 20 minutes. Maybe 25. Okay. Reeves's voice was steady and precise. Don't stand up. Stay seated. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Roman listened. Reeves talked him through the next 40 minutes, step by step. What to take, in what order, when, what to watch for. Roman's hands were shaking hard enough that he had to open one of the medication bottles with his teeth. He did it without remarking on it, the way you do things you simply need to do. At 5 p.m., his blood pressure read 94/62. Still low, not critical. At 5:30, it was 102/68. Better, Reeves said when Roman read him the number. How's the vision? Clearer. Balance? Better. Stay seated for another hour. Don't eat anything for 2 hours. Call me if anything changes. A pause. Roman. Yeah. You caught it, Reeves said. You read the journal, and you caught the distinction between the protocols, and you called. That was the right thing. I almost didn't, Roman said. I almost just took the other medication and waited it out. I know, Reeves said, but you didn't. Roman sat on the couch for the next hour with the blood pressure cuff on his arm and the journal open in his lap and the lake going orange and then purple outside the window, and he thought about a woman sitting in this same position at 2 a.m. for 22 years, except she'd been doing it for someone who hadn't known she was there, and she'd been doing it without a journal to tell her what to do, because she was the journal. At 7 o'clock, he got up carefully, tested his balance, and went to the kitchen to get water. His phone was on the counter. He stood looking at it. He picked it up. He found Elena's number. He looked at it for a long time. The contact's still there, still labeled the way he'd labeled it years ago. Just her first name, the way you label people who are so continuously present in your life that additional identification feels redundant. He put the phone down without calling. He wasn't ready. And for the first time in his life, Roman DeLuca understood the difference between not being ready and simply not wanting to. He was not ready. He did not yet have the right words, and he understood now, with a clarity that the afternoon's events had stripped clean of any remaining self-protection, that when he called Elena, if he called Elena, he would need words commensurate with what she had actually done. He did not yet have those words. What arrived 3 days later was something he hadn't accounted for. Dante Moretti arrived at the penthouse unannounced, which was either a statement of disrespect or a test, and Roman recognized it as both. Dante was the second-ranking figure in the DeLuca organization, 55 years old, wearing his authority the way men wear it when they've been waiting a long time and have recently concluded the wait might be approaching its end. He had sharp dark eyes and a handshake that communicated something specific about where he believed the power in the room resided. Sit down, Dante, Roman said. Dante sat. He looked around the penthouse with the careful attention of a man taking inventory. Nice place, he said. What do you need? Dante settled back in the chair with a comfort that was itself a message. There are concerns, he said, in the organization, about continuity, about leadership capacity going forward. Roman looked at him steadily. Concerns from who? From people who have significant investments in stability. Dante paused. There are stories about the divorce, which is understood, a man's personal business, about health matters that are, another pause, waited, that are less personal when they affect the functioning of the organization. Roman said nothing. He let the silence work the way it always worked, waiting for Dante to fill it. Dante was smart enough not to fill it immediately. They sat for almost 20 seconds before Dante spoke again. Nothing is being said openly, Dante said. I want you to understand that. There's no challenge. Nobody's made a move. But there are conversations happening that, in my assessment, you should be aware of. I'm aware, Roman said. Good. Dante nodded. Then you understand that the timeline for some clarity on Dante. Roman's voice dropped half a register. Old habit. The particular frequency he'd discovered decades ago that made rooms quiet. Be specific about what you're asking me. Dante looked at him for a moment. Then, with the directness of a man who has decided that careful language is no longer serving him, I'm asking whether Roman DeLuca is going to be running this organization in 6 months, because if the answer is no, or if the answer is uncertain, people need to plan accordingly. Roman sat very still. In 31 years of running the DeLuca organization, no one had sat in his space and asked him that question. It had the quality of a thing he had never imagined would happen, which meant he had no prepared response for it, no automatic deflection, no ready performance. He was sitting across from a man who was telling him, in careful language, that his empire was beginning to wonder whether he was still its emperor. He thought about the blood pressure cuff, the journal, the 4 words Elena had written, "He will forget this." He thought about a Wednesday afternoon when his vision went wrong and his hands shook, and the only thing standing between him and a serious medical event was a worn leather book written by a woman he had called dispensable. He looked at Dante Moretti and understood, with total and devastating clarity, that he was fighting on 2 fronts now, his body from the inside and his empire from the outside, and that he currently had adequate resources to manage neither, and that the woman who had quietly been the solution to the first problem was gone. "Tell the people who are having conversations," Roman said, in the voice that had always been sufficient, "that Roman DeLuca has been running this organization for 31 years, and that nothing about that changes." Dante nodded. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. "Good," he said. And the word, short, almost kind, carried in it the exact amount of belief Roman had given him reason to have, which was not Dante left without looking back, which was itself a message. Roman stood at the window for a long time after the elevator closed. The lake had gone dark. The city lights were coming on in that particular Chicago way, not all at once, but in clusters, neighborhood by neighborhood, like something breathing. He'd always liked that about this city, the way it came alive at dusk without asking permission. He picked up his phone and called Marco. "Dante Moretti," he said when Marco answered. "I want to know every meeting he's had in the last 30 days. Every call he's made to anyone in the organization above street level. I want names, locations, and I want it by tomorrow morning." "Already started," Marco said. Roman lowered the phone. Of course he had. Marco had seen Dante's car in the building garage and had started making calls before the elevator reached the 47th floor. 11 years. The man was worth 3 times what Roman paid him, which was already considerable. He went to bed at 11. He lay awake until 2. His heart did the wrong thing again at 1:47 a.m. He was awake for it this time, lying on his back, and he felt it start. The stuttering, the arrhythmic lurch, the cold sweat blooming along his spine. He didn't panic. He reached for the blood pressure cuff. Ran it. 88/57. He reached for the journal. Elena had an entry for nighttime BP events. He found it in under a minute now. He'd been through the journal enough times that his hands knew where to go. He followed the protocol. He lay still. He breathed the way she'd written down, slow, deliberate, 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Not yoga breathing, just deliberate. Tell him it works because it activates parasympathetic response. He'll be more willing if he understands the mechanism. She had known he'd need to understand why. She'd anticipated even that. He did the breathing. It worked. By 2:30, his blood pressure had climbed back to 97/64, and the arrhythmia had settled into something approaching normal rhythm. He lay in the dark with the cuff still on his arm and the journal on his chest and stared at the ceiling of a penthouse that suddenly felt very large. He thought about Dante's face, the particular quality of that nod before he left. Too slow, too settled, the nod of a man who had already reached a conclusion and was simply completing a formality. Roman had 2 problems. They were the same problem, at the root of it. He had built his entire existence, the empire, the identity, the invulnerability, on a foundation that turned out to have had a person in it. One specific person doing invisible structural work that kept the whole thing standing. He had removed that person, and now both the personal and the professional were showing their cracks, at the same time in front of an audience. He was not accustomed to cracks. He slept for 4 hours. He was up at 6:30 with his jaw set and something cold and clear behind his eyes that people who knew him well would have recognized as the particular focus Roman DeLuca brought to situations he had decided were wars. Marco arrived at 7 with coffee and a file. The file was thorough. Marco was always thorough. Roman went through it at the kitchen counter. The medications already taken, the chart checked twice, the cuff run at 6:45, numbers acceptable, and read through Dante's movements over the past month with the attention of a man reading a map of his own territory. 11 separate meetings. 4 of them with organization members at or above the level where decisions about leadership could actually be made. 2 meetings Roman couldn't account for. Locations that didn't correspond to known business sites. 2 men Marco had photographed entering but whose identities were still being verified. The 2 unknowns, Roman said. How soon? Tonight at the latest, Marco said. Roman closed the file. Set up a meeting. All 4 of the senior men Dante visited. My place tonight, 7 o'clock. Don't tell them Dante's been made. Marco wrote it down. He didn't ask why. He understood why. Roman spent the rest of this morning on the phone with his attorney about the insurance authorizations. A process that was moving, slowly, like something heavy being pushed uphill. And then with Diane about the care coordinator search, which had produced 3 candidates, none of whom Diane seemed fully confident about. The best of the 3 has strong credentials, Diane said. 14 years in complex case management, but she's never worked with, she doesn't have the specific familiarity with your condition that nobody does, Roman said. Except Elena. A pause. No, Diane agreed carefully. Nobody does. Put her on a retainer, starting immediately. I'll meet with her this week. He paused. And Diane, I need the full accounting of what the medical management cost annually, total, everything Elena was coordinating. Another pause. Longer. Roman, Diane said, with the tone of someone deciding to say an honest thing rather than a comfortable one. I already ran those numbers. When you're ready to see them, send them now. She sent them. Roman opened the email and looked at the spreadsheet and sat with it for a moment. The number at the bottom, annual total, fully loaded, including the specialist coordination, the insurance architecture, the pharmacy relationships, the emergency protocols, was not a number he had imagined, not remotely. It was the kind of number that recontextualized 22 years of assumptions about what Elena's role had actually been. She had managed, annually, a medical operation larger than several of his legitimate businesses. She had done it from a kitchen, from a bedroom, from hospital waiting rooms and midnight phone calls, without a staff, without a title, without, and this was the part that sat on him like something physical, without ever once presenting him with a bill. He closed the email. He stood up from the kitchen counter. He walked to the window. He stood there with both hands pressed flat against the glass, looking at the lake, breathing. He was not going to call her from a position of crisis. He had told himself that, and he was keeping it. Not because the crisis wasn't real, but because calling Elena from the middle of a crisis was exactly what he would have done in the old life, summoning her to solve something he'd broken and then moving on when it was solved. He was not doing that again. He didn't fully know yet what he was doing instead, but he knew it wasn't that. The meeting that evening started at 7:02 p.m., 4 men. He'd known all of them for at least a decade. Jimmy Caruso, who ran the near North Side operations, and had the deceptive ease of someone who'd learned to be underestimated and profit from it. Paul Esposito, 63 years old, the organization's longest-serving member at the senior level, who had known Roman's father and had the steady demeanor of a man who'd watched power shift before and developed opinions about how it moved. Vincent Lau, who handled the financial infrastructure with a precision that Roman had always valued and who rarely said anything without having thought it through twice. And Frank Ardetti, the youngest of the 4 at 48, who had come up under Roman's direct mentorship and who Roman watched now with particular attention, looking for the specific quality of a man trying to decide where his loyalty actually lived. They sat at the dining table. Roman sat at the head. He didn't offer drinks. He didn't make preliminary conversation. He put Dante Moretti's name on the table the way you put evidence in front of a jury, directly, without theater. Dante came to see me yesterday, he said. He told me there were concerns about leadership capacity, about continuity. He looked around the table slowly. I want to know whether anyone in this room has had a conversation with Dante Moretti about my health in the past 30 days. The silence that followed was its own kind of information. Roman read it the way he read rooms. Not the words people said, but the fraction of a second pause before they said them. The micro-adjustment of someone deciding in real time what version of the truth to offer. Paul Esposito spoke first. Dante approached me, he said. No preamble, no hedge. 3 weeks ago. I told him that until I heard something different from you directly, I wasn't having that conversation. Roman looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Paul. Jimmy Caruso looked at the table and then at Roman. He called me. I didn't meet with him in person. He was fishing. I didn't take the bait. Vincent Lau said nothing, which was the same thing as speaking. Roman looked at him. Vincent. Lau looked up. He was a careful man, precise in all things. And what crossed his face now was the expression of someone weighing two calculations against each other and not being satisfied with either outcome. He asked for a meeting, Lau said. I went. I listened. I didn't commit to anything. What did he want? Lau was quiet for a moment. He wanted to know whether the organization's financial interests could survive a prolonged period of uncertain leadership. He used that phrase, uncertain leadership. And what did you tell him? I told him I'd need more information before I could have that conversation. Roman nodded slowly. He looked at Frank Ardetti, who was the only one who hadn't spoken, and who was sitting with both hands on the table in a stillness that Roman recognized as the specific stillness of someone who has decided in advance what they're going to say and is waiting for their moment. Frank, Roman said. Frank met his eyes. I met with him twice, he said. Flat. No apology in it, but no aggression either. The tone of someone who has decided that if they're going to be honest, they're going to be honest completely. I wanted to hear what he was building. I didn't agree to anything, but I listened. Why? Frank held his gaze. Because I didn't know what was true about your health. Because nobody tells us anything and we're supposed to just maintain confidence on zero information. He paused. I've worked for you for 16 years. I came to you when I had nothing. That means something to me. But I also have 40 people whose livelihoods depend on this organization staying stable, and if the organization is going to go through a transition, I need to know. The table was absolutely quiet. Roman looked at Frank for a long time, long enough that the younger man's composure showed the first sign of strain, a slight tightening around the eyes, the almost imperceptible shift of someone holding themselves very still under significant pressure. Then Roman said, "That's a fair answer." Frank blinked. He hadn't expected that. "You should have come to me," Roman said. "Not to Dante, to me. That's the only part that was wrong." He looked around the table. "All of you. If you have questions about my health, my capacity, the future of this organization, you come to me. That's been the rule for 31 years, and it doesn't change because someone with ambitions decides to have quiet meetings." He paused. "My health requires management," he said. "It has for a long time. I'm managing it. There will be changes to how I operate. Less field presence, more delegation to people I trust. That transition was going to happen eventually regardless, and it's happening on my terms, not Dante Moretti's." He waited to see if anyone was going to say something to that. Nobody did. "Dante is going to be moved out of his current position," Roman said. "I haven't decided the details yet. What I need to know right now is whether I have the four of you." Paul Esposito said yes before Roman finished the sentence. Jimmy Caruso nodded. Vincent Lau looked at the table for a moment, then at Roman. "Yes." Frank Ardetti looked at his hands. Then he looked up and said simply and without performance, "Yes." Roman looked at each of them in turn. "Good," he said. "Then let's talk about how this organization runs going forward." They talked for 3 hours. Real talk. The kind of operational conversation Roman hadn't fully engaged in for years, because he'd been accustomed to decisions flowing from him downward and the architecture of implementation being someone else's problem. He asked questions he'd never asked before. He listened in a different way than he'd previously listened. The health event of the previous Wednesday, the morning with the medication bottles, the 4 words written in a journal. He will forget this. All of it was operating in him like a recalibration he hadn't consciously agreed to, but couldn't stop. By the time the 4 men left at 10:15, something had shifted in the room that Roman couldn't have named precisely, but recognized as significant. A different kind of agreement than the usual kind. Something built on actual disclosure rather than performed certainty. He was clearing glasses from the table when his phone rang. Sophia. "Dad," she said, and her voice had the particular quality he'd learned over 3 decades of being her father to take seriously immediately. Not panic, she didn't panic, but an elevation. something close to the surface that she was working to keep controlled. I need you to listen to me. I'm listening. I talked to Dr. Yates today. A breath. She called me because she couldn't reach you, and she needed someone to. She wanted me to know that your last set of blood work came back, and there's a marker that's, Dad, there's a new complication. A potential one. She needs to see you tomorrow morning, and she was very specific that it needs to be tomorrow. Roman stood at the dining table with a glass in each hand and the city glowing behind the floor-to-ceiling windows and said, "What kind of complication?" "Cardiac involvement," Sophia said. "Possible. It's not confirmed, it's a marker, but it's one that indicates, with your condition, cardiac involvement changes the management picture significantly. It changes the urgency picture." Roman set the glasses down on the table. He did it slowly and carefully, the way you set things down when your hands need to be doing something while your mind does something else. "Right," he said. "All right?" Sophia's voice went up half a register. "Dad, I'm saying this is serious. I'm saying you need to—" "I know what you're saying." He sat down in the nearest chair. "I'll be there tomorrow morning, first thing." "I want to fly in." "Sophia, I'm not asking," she said. And her voice had dropped back down to that steadiness again, the controlled temperature of a doctor delivering news. "I'm coming Thursday. You don't have to pick me up. I just need to know you'll be there tomorrow morning." "I'll be there," he said. After the call, he sat in the chair for a long time. Cardiac involvement. The phrase had a specific weight to it. He knew enough now, having spent the past 3 weeks learning his own medical situation with the desperate focus of a man who'd realized too late how much he hadn't known, to understand what that phrase meant in the context of his condition. It meant the disease was expanding its territory. It meant the management picture, already complex, already requiring more than he currently had in place, was about to become more complex. He picked up the journal from the coffee table where it had lived for 3 weeks now, permanent as furniture. He opened it to a section he'd read before but returned to differently now. Elena's entries from 6 years ago, when she'd noted a particular set of symptoms and had made calls to Dr. Okonkwo in Houston. The cardiovascular specialist Roman hadn't known existed until 3 weeks ago. She'd been watching for this. 6 years ago, she'd been watching for exactly this marker, consulting a cardiologist, adjusting protocols in anticipation of a complication that was now, apparently, beginning to arrive. She had seen it coming from 6 years out. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood up. He went to the kitchen. He ran the blood pressure cuff. 104/71, acceptable. He took his 10 p.m. medications in the right order, with the right intervals, eating the small amount of food the protocol required even though he wasn't hungry. He did all of it correctly, from memory now. The chart internalized over 3 weeks of repetition and 2 near misses and 1 genuine crisis that had taught him what a real crisis felt like. He washed the glass, he dried it, he put it away. He picked up his phone. He stood in the kitchen in the quiet of the penthouse, the city doing its nighttime thing beyond the glass, and he found Elena's contact. He stood there looking at her name for almost 2 minutes. He called. It rang 3 times. He was already composing how to handle voicemail when she picked up. "Roman." Her voice was careful. Not cold, careful. The particular temperature of someone who has prepared themselves for a range of possibilities and is waiting to determine which one has arrived. "Elena," he said, and then he stopped, because the speech he had been constructing in his head for 3 weeks turned out to be unavailable. All the careful words, the organized acknowledgments, the things he'd planned to say when he'd found the right moment and the right readiness, gone, in the actual presence of her voice, replaced by a silence that stretched for several seconds, and that he couldn't fill because nothing he'd prepared was adequate. "Are you all right?" she asked. 3 words. The same 3 words she had apparently asked herself on his behalf several thousand times over 22 years. How can I help him live one more day? He'd read it in the journal. He understood what it had cost. "No," he said. Honest, the way he'd been learning to be, in very small increments over these weeks. Not entirely. A pause on her end. He heard something in the background, shy, quiet, domestic. A television, maybe. The sound of a life that wasn't his. "What's happening?" she said. "Dr. Yates called Sophia. There's—" He stopped, started again. "There's a marker, cardiac. I see Yates tomorrow morning. Silence. Elena. He sat down on the couch. His voice, when it came, wasn't the voice he used in meetings. It wasn't the voice he used with his men or his attorneys or anyone in the life he'd built. It was something older than all of that, something he'd almost forgotten he had. I know I don't have the right to call you about this. I know what I threw away, and I know that I didn't understand it when I did it, and I know that understanding it now doesn't change what it was. But He stopped again. The silence held. I'm listening, she said. Quietly. Not warmly. He wasn't asking for warmth, and she knew that, just present, available. The same way she'd been present for 22 years in a way he had never been present back. The journal, he said. I read the whole thing, every page. He looked at the worn cover on the coffee table. The entry from March 4th, 12 years ago. You were up until 2:40 in the morning. You wrote that I was sleeping, that it was good. She said nothing. He heard her breathing change, barely, just slightly, an almost imperceptible shift. I didn't know, he said. I want you to know that I know that's not an excuse. It's just, I need you to know that I didn't know, because if I had known, I would have... He stopped. Because he wasn't sure, actually. He wasn't sure what he would have done. The version of him that existed 12 years ago was not a version he could fully defend. Roman, Elena said, very quietly. Yeah. What do you need right now? He closed his eyes. Of all the things she could have said, of all the ways she could have responded to the inadequate, 3-week-late, crisis-driven acknowledgement he had just delivered, she asked what he needed. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I wanted to hear your voice. I know that's not enough of a reason. I know you've moved on, and you deserve... Roman. A pause. I'll call Dr. Yates in the morning before your appointment to make sure she has the full picture of what we were watching for. She needs to know about the Houston protocol. She and Okonkwo weren't fully synced on the last adjustment I made before March. A breath. I'll send her notes tonight. He sat completely still. She was going to help him. Not because he'd earned it. Not because he'd said the right things. Because it was what she did. Because 22 years of orientation toward keeping him alive didn't simply stop because a signature on a piece of paper said it should. Thank you, he said. And he meant it with everything he currently had, which was the first time in his life he'd meant those 2 words completely. Get some sleep, she said. Your body needs it, especially before a cardiac assessment. Solid 8 hours if you can. I know, he said. It's in the journal. A silence. Then, and he wasn't sure, he couldn't be certain, he thought he heard something that might have been the very beginning of something softer. Not forgiveness. Not an opening. Just the sound of a person who is, despite everything, still human. Good night, Roman, she said. Good night, Elena. The line went quiet. He sat with the phone in his hand for a long time. The city kept doing what cities do. The lake was out there in the dark, indifferent and enormous. The same water it had always been regardless of what was happening to the people watching it from the 47th floor. He set the phone down. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to his heart, steady now, finding its rhythm, imperfect and fragile and still, for the moment, beating. And he thought about tomorrow morning, about Dr. Yates and what she would tell him, about the cardiac marker and what it meant for the management picture and what the management picture would require. And underneath all of that, he thought about a woman sitting at a kitchen table with a phone, after a call she probably hadn't expected tonight, pulling up notes she'd written months ago to send to a doctor who needed them, doing one more quiet thing for a man who still hadn't fully learned how to deserve it. His chest tightened. Not the disease this time, something else, something older and simpler and considerably more difficult to manage than anything in the 12-page chart. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 18 miles away, in a private consultation room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, Dr. Yates opened her email at 11:47 p.m. and found a message from Elena Marlowe, time-stamped 11 minutes prior, with a subject line that read, Roman DeLuca, cardiac involvement, Houston protocol notes and prior observations. She opened it. She began reading. She was still reading at 12:30 a.m., and by the time she reached the final page, she had picked up her pen and begun making notes in the margin, and her expression had settled into the particular focused gravity of a physician who has just understood that the case in front of her is both more complex and more survivable than she'd believed. Provided the next 24 hours, Dr. Yates was already at her desk when Roman arrived at 7:52 a.m. That told him something. Her first appointment wasn't until 9. She'd come in early, which meant the notes Elena had sent the night before had changed the shape of the morning in ways he wasn't going to enjoy learning about. She stood when he came in, which she'd never done before. Another thing that told him something. "Sit down, Roman," she said. "Not Mr. DeLuca." Roman. The shift in address, from a physician as precise and professionally boundaried as Karen Yates, landed with a specific weight. He sat. She had Elena's notes printed and annotated on her desk, 12 pages of them, margins dense with her own handwriting in red ink, the evidence of a midnight and early morning spent doing serious work. She put her hand flat on the stack before she began, a gesture he'd noticed certain doctors make when they were about to say something they'd organized carefully. "I need to start by telling you that what Elena sent me last night changed my assessment of your situation significantly," she said. "Not in the direction you're probably hoping. Tell me." "The cardiac marker we flagged in your blood work, I initially read it as early-stage involvement, something we had time to monitor before making protocol adjustments." She opened the top page. "Elena's notes document a pattern of observations going back 14 months that I didn't have access to. Symptom progression she was tracking that correlates with this marker in a way that suggests the involvement is further along than the blood work alone indicates." Roman said nothing. He looked at the annotated pages. "She was watching for this," Yates said. "Specifically, she had a standing call with Dr. Okonkwo in Houston every 6 weeks to discuss the cardiac picture. He was adjusting your protocol in response to what she was observing. When she stepped away from that coordination role, those adjustments stopped." She paused. "For 4 months." 4 months. Roman did the arithmetic. The divorce had been finalized in March. It was now the last week of July. "What does 4 months mean?" he asked. Yates looked at him steadily. "It means we're managing a situation that's had 4 months of inadequate surveillance on the cardiac side. It means I need to get Dr. Okonkwo on a call today." Elena included his direct line in the full protocol notes, which is the only reason I can do that efficiently. "And it means you're going to need a procedure within the next 2 to 3 weeks to address a specific rhythm issue that's developed." "A procedure," Roman said. "An ablation, to correct the arrhythmia." She watched his face. "The episodes you've been having at night, you've had them before, I imagine, but they've been increasing." "Yes. That's why." She turned a page. "The good news, and there is good news, is that this is addressable. It's not a crisis. It became more urgent than it needed to be because of the surveillance gap, but it's not beyond what we can manage effectively." She paused. "Provided we move now and don't wait." Roman looked at his hands on his knees. They were still. This morning they were still. "Set up the call with Okonkwo," he said. "Today." "I already emailed him at 6 this morning. He responds early." She picked up her pen. "Roman, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Have you spoken with Elena about all of this?" He looked up. "Last night." "And?" "She sent you the notes," he said. Yates nodded slowly. "She did. At 11:50 at night, within minutes of getting off the phone with you." She set her pen down. "I want you to understand something that I think you might not be fully accounting for. The notes she sent, the organization of them, the completeness, the annotations she added specifically for my benefit to explain her decision-making. That's not something you pull together in 20 minutes. She had those ready. She's been maintaining them. Even after March, she's been keeping the documentation current." Roman was very still. "She never stopped," Yates said simply. "She removed herself from the active coordination role, but she never stopped documenting." He looked at the window. Chicago morning outside, pale summer light on the glass, the city going about its ordinary business with the total indifference of a city that doesn't know or care what's happening in a 14th floor consultation room. He thought about Elena in her small apartment, the one Sophia had described, near the clinic where she worked, a balcony, flowers she'd been growing. He'd asked Sophia about it in one of their daily calls, unable to explain exactly why he needed to picture it. Sophia had described it with a careful warmth that told him she was glad to be talking about her mother living a good life, and that she was also watching him very carefully for what he was going to do with the information. Elena, in a small apartment with flowers on a balcony, maintaining documentation on a man she'd walked away from. Not because she was waiting, not because she expected anything. He understood that instinctively, and understanding it made it heavier, not lighter. "Schedule the ablation," he said. "Whatever I need to do to prepare for it, tell me," Yates told him. He listened and took notes in his own handwriting on a legal pad he'd started carrying 2 weeks ago. Another habit he'd developed, writing things down, externalizing the things he used to rely on other people to hold for him. The list was getting long. I was getting better at using it. He left at 9:30. He sat in the car with Marco and didn't give a destination for a moment. Then he said, "Take me to the DeLuca building." The DeLuca building on Wacker Drive was the legitimate face of the organization. Offices, property management, the import business that had been the original cover and had eventually become genuinely profitable on its own terms. Roman hadn't been there in 3 weeks. The lobby security guard, a man named Curtis, who'd been at that desk for 9 years, looked up when Roman walked in and did a fractional double take before composing himself. "Mr. DeLuca," Curtis said. "Good morning." "Curtis?" Roman stopped at the desk. "How's your daughter, the one who was applying to Northwestern?" Curtis blinked. "She got in, sir. September." "Good," Roman said. He meant it. He hadn't asked about Curtis's daughter in the 4 years he'd known Curtis had one, which was its own indictment he'd only recently taken inventory of. "Congratulations." He went upstairs. He called a meeting of his senior staff, not the organization's senior men, but the building's, the legitimate operation, his business manager, his property director, his legal counsel. He told them what he was telling them in the same direct language he'd used the night before with Caruso and Esposito and Lau and Ardetti, stripped of everything except what was true. "I have a health situation that requires real management," he said. "I'll be present and functional and making decisions. But the operational structure of everything I oversee needs to be reorganized, so it doesn't depend on my constant presence. We're going to build that structure now, properly, and I'm going to delegate in ways I haven't before." His business manager, a 40-year-old woman named Cecilia, who had been professionally cautious in his presence for 3 years and whom he had never actually asked for her opinion, said, "Can I speak honestly?" "That's what I'm asking for," Roman said. "We've needed this structure for a long time," she said. "The organization runs on your authority, which means every decision, even small ones, waits for you. If you delegated 2 years ago, you'd have a machine by now. You're starting later than you should have, but it's not too late." Roman looked at her for a moment. "Then let's start." They worked for 4 hours. Real work. Organizational charts, decision trees, authorization structures that didn't require Roman's signature for routine operations. Cecilia drove most of it, with the organized energy of someone who had been waiting a long time to be allowed to do the job she was capable of doing. Roman watched her and thought about Elena. About capable people who function brilliantly when given real authority and real acknowledgement, and what it costs them to operate in the absence of both. He left at 2 in the afternoon. He called Dante Moretti from the car. Dante answered on the first ring, which told Roman he'd been waiting. "Roman," Dante said, with the particular warmth of a man who hasn't decided yet how the conversation is going to go. "I want to meet," Roman said. "Tonight. Just the 2 of us." A pause. "Of course," Dante said. "Where?" "The restaurant on Hubbard, 7 o'clock. Come alone." He hung up. He looked out the window at the city moving past. "Marco?" he said. "Sir?" "After tonight, Dante Moretti is going to step down from his position. I need it handled carefully, quietly, no escalation. He gets a settlement that respects his tenure and makes it clear that walking away is the dignified option. Can you make sure the right people understand the parameters before tomorrow morning?" Marco glanced in the rearview mirror. "Already in motion," he said. "Since this morning." Roman looked at him. "You called him last night," Marco said simply. "I know what that call means." Roman turned back to the window. "What would I do without you, Marco?" Marco was quiet for a moment. Then, with the dryness of a man who has earned the right to a small amount of honesty, "Considerably worse, sir." The dinner with Dante that evening lasted 47 minutes. Dante arrived already knowing. Roman could see it in the way he sat down. not the settled authority of his visit to the penthouse 3 days ago, but something more careful, a man who had done the math overnight and arrived at an answer he hadn't preferred. He was still composed. Dante had always been composed. It was one of the things Roman had genuinely valued in him for a long time. "You built something well," Roman said, after the initial silence. "The quiet meetings, the conversations with the financial side before you came to me, that was patient work." Dante didn't deny it. "I thought the time was right," he said. "You weren't wrong about the conditions," Roman said. "You were wrong about what I was going to do about them." Dante looked at him. "And what are you going to do about them?" "Adapt," Roman said, "which is something you didn't think I was capable of." A long pause. Dante picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking. "I've known you for 23 years, he said. "You've never adapted to anything. You've overpowered it or removed it." "I know," Roman said. "That's been true. It's not going to be true going forward." Dante studied him for a moment, looking for the performance, the calculation underneath. Roman let him look. He had nothing to perform. "The offer," Roman said, "is generous, and it's the only one. You take it, and you leave with your dignity and your money and your record intact, and nobody in this city has a reason to look at you sideways. That's worth something. You know what the alternative is." Dante knew. He left 40 minutes later with a handshake that was real enough. The handshake of a man who had tried something, found it blocked by a version of his opponent he hadn't anticipated, and had the intelligence to recognize the difference between a loss and a catastrophe. Roman sat alone at the table for a while after he left. He ate the rest of his meal. He took his 7 p.m. medications with the glass of water he'd ordered specifically for that purpose, which the waiter had noted without comment, which Roman had noted the waiter noting without embarrassment. Another small thing. He was accumulating small things. Sophia arrived Thursday morning on a 6:00 a.m. flight. He met her at the door of the penthouse. She was 31 years old, and she looked like her mother in the eyes, and like him in the jaw, and she was carrying a medical bag along with her overnight bag, which made him feel something specific that he didn't try to name, just let it move through him and settle. She looked at him for a moment in the doorway. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and Roman held his daughter with both arms and stood there in the doorway of the penthouse and held on for a moment longer than he usually permitted himself. "You look tired," she said when she stepped back, looking at him clinically and personally at once, the way doctors who love their patients can't help doing. "I've been learning things," he said. She came in. She put her bag down. She looked around the penthouse with the careful attention of someone assessing an environment, and then she went directly to the kitchen and looked at the medication setup. The chart on the counter, the bottles organized by time of day, the legal pad with his handwritten notes. She stood looking at it for a long moment. "You did this yourself," she said. "Yes." She turned around. Something in her face had shifted. The clinical layer was still there, but underneath it, something softer and more complicated was visible. "Mom taught me to set up a medication station like this," she said quietly, "in my first year of residency. She said it was the most important organizational skill she knew." Roman looked at his daughter. "She taught herself," he said. "I know," Sophia said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same kind of kitchen table configuration, Roman thought, that Elena had sat at alone for years in the house in Lincoln Park, late at night with the medications prepared and the house quiet around her. He and Sophia sat there together now and talked for 2 hours in the way they hadn't talked in years. Not the managed conversations, not the Sunday calls where everyone was careful. Actually talked. About his health and what the ablation would involve, and what the realistic picture was going forward, and what Sophia thought, as a physician, about the care coordination arrangements he'd put in place. She had opinions. He listened to them. He asked questions he couldn't have asked 6 weeks ago because 6 weeks ago he hadn't known enough to ask them. Toward the end of the second hour, Sophia said, "Are you going to see her?" Roman was quiet for a moment. "That's up to her. She hasn't said no. She hasn't said yes either." "She sent Dr. Yates 14 pages of notes at midnight," Sophia said. "I know what that means about where she is. I think you know too." Roman looked at his coffee cup. "I know what it means about who she is. That's not the same as knowing what she wants." Sophia looked at him for a moment. "That might be the smartest thing I've ever heard you say." He looked up. "I mean it," she said. Knowing the difference. She paused. Go see her, Dad. Not to ask for anything, not to fix anything. Just go. Say what you said on the phone, in person, where it counts. The ablation procedure happened on a Tuesday, 11 days later, at Northwestern Memorial, the same hospital where Elena had worked 30 years ago, a fact that Roman noted and kept to himself. Dr. Okonkwo flew in from Houston, which had not been Roman's expectation, but turned out to be Dr. Yates's condition for proceeding, because the procedure required the cardiovascular knowledge Okonkwo had accumulated on Roman's case over years of coordination calls with a woman who was no longer in the room. Roman was in pre-op for an hour before they put him under. He lay on the gurney in the pre-op area with the particular suspended quality of a man waiting for something he can't control, which was a sensation he had experienced very rarely in his life and which he found now less terrifying than he'd have predicted. Maybe because the things he couldn't control had recently revealed themselves to be much larger than he'd understood, and having the territory mapped was its own strange comfort. Sophia was in the waiting area. She'd taken a week of leave. Roman had told her she didn't need to. She'd looked at him with her mother's eyes and said nothing further, which was answer enough. He was out of the procedure in just under 3 hours. Recovery was not elegant. He was in the hospital for 2 nights, and the 2 nights were uncomfortable in the way of hospital nights. Interrupted and fluorescent and humbling in the specific way that physical vulnerability is always humbling, which is completely and without exception. The nurses were professional and impersonal in the way Roman had once found dehumanizing and now understood as the appropriate professional stance of people doing technical work on other people's bodies. He was polite to all of them. He thanked them by name. He'd been doing this for 2 weeks, and it still felt slightly unfamiliar, like a shoe he hadn't broken in yet, but it felt less unfamiliar each time. On the second night, Sophia went home to sleep, and Marco was in the hallway, and Roman was alone in the room at 2 a.m., with the particular wakefulness of a hospital night, and he picked up his phone and found Elena's contact and looked at it. He didn't call. He'd been talking to Dr. Yates about whether to call. In the sideways way, he talked about Elena with the people who knew them both, not asking for advice exactly, just circling. He'd been circling for weeks. He sent a text instead. Procedure done. They say it went well. I wanted you to know. He put the phone down. He didn't expect a response at 2 a.m. At 2:14 a.m., his phone lit up. I'm glad. Rest now. Drink water when you wake up. He looked at those 2 sentences for a long time. Drink water when you wake up. Clinical. Practical. The most Elena sentence she could possibly have sent. He could hear her voice in it. Not warm, not cold, but present. The particular presence of someone who is still, despite everything, paying attention. He put the phone on the nightstand. He drank the water that was already on the nightstand because she was right, and because doing the things that were right when he was told they were right was a habit he was constructing deliberately, one small instance at a time. He slept. He was discharged on Thursday morning. Cecilia had restructured his business calendar to give him 2 weeks of reduced load. Diane had the care coordinator, a woman named Patricia Holt, methodical and knowledgeable, who reminded him in no way of Elena except in her absolute refusal to be intimidated by him, fully onboarded and operating. The medication chart was memorized. The journal lived on his nightstand. 3 weeks after the procedure, Roman DeLuca drove to a neighborhood in Wicker Park he'd never visited, parked on a tree-lined street, and sat in the car for 4 minutes before getting out. The building was modest. 4 stories, brick. The kind of building that had been there long enough to have settled into its own quiet authority. There were window boxes on some of the upper floors with late summer flowers in them. He didn't know which window was hers. He hadn't asked Sophia, because asking Sophia for that felt like the wrong way to arrive. He pressed the buzzer for apartment 3C. Elena's name was written on a small card in her handwriting, neat, precise, the same script as the journal. He stood looking at it until the intercom crackled. Yes? It's Roman, he said. A silence. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The door buzzed open. He took the stairs. 3rd floor, apartment at the end of the hall. She was standing in the open doorway when he got there, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the hallway, with the particular disorientation of 2 people who spent 22 years in close proximity and are now encountering each other in a context neither of them fully knows how to navigate. She looked good. That was the first thing. Not the performed good of the charity events and the organization dinners, where she'd always been appropriately presented. Actually good, rested in a way he couldn't remember seeing in a long time, wearing a cardigan he didn't recognize over a plain shirt, her hair down, the beginning of something that might have been silver at her temples that he noticed and found, unexpectedly, beautiful. She stepped back from the door without speaking. He came inside. The apartment was small and bright and had the particular character of a space that had been deliberately made into something, not decorated for performance but arranged for actual living. Books on shelves that were clearly read rather than displayed. A kitchen table with a single place setting still out from breakfast. And the balcony. The door was open, afternoon light coming through, and he could see the plants she'd been growing, a dozen or more of them, green and flowering, crowded together in the small space with the slightly haphazard abundance of things that are growing because they want to. He stopped in the middle of the living room and looked at the balcony. "You have a lot of plants," he said. "I always wanted them," she said. "You didn't like the mess." He turned and looked at her. She was standing near the kitchen, arms not crossed. She wasn't being closed, just careful, watching him with the same clinical personal combination he'd seen in Sophia's eyes, and now understood as something they shared, a way of seeing people that went past the surface into the working parts. "I know," he said. She moved to the kitchen. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove in the automatic way of someone doing something familiar, buying time with the small ritual of it. "How are you feeling?" she said. "After the procedure." "Better," he said. "The arrhythmia is gone. Yates says the cardiac situation is stable as long as we stay on top of the protocol." He paused. "Okonkwo came from Houston." "I know," she said. "He emailed me." Roman looked at her back. "You're still in contact with him." "He wanted me to know the outcome." She turned slightly. "I worked with him for 7 years, Roman. He was worried about you." Roman sat down in one of the chairs at the kitchen table, not asking, but it seemed like the right thing, and she didn't object. He put his hands on the table and looked at them. They were still today. They'd been steadier since the ablation. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need to say it without it being about anything else. Not about asking you for help, not about the medical situation, just what it is." Elena turned to face him. She leaned against the counter and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully interpret, which was appropriate, he thought. He'd lost the fluency he might once have had in reading her face. "I read the journal," he said. "All of it, every page, multiple times." She said nothing. "The entry from Sophia's 7th birthday. You'd been up the night before until 4 in the morning with the medication adjustment, and you still had the whole party organized by noon. She doesn't know that. I didn't know that." He stopped. "The call you made to Houston on my behalf in 2019, the night of the Caruso situation, when I was under more stress than I'd been in years, and you'd apparently noticed something in my symptoms, and you called Okonkwo at 11 at night to ask if you should adjust the protocol." He looked at his hands. "You didn't tell me you were scared. You just called the doctor." "I didn't want to make it worse," she said quietly. "I know." He looked up. "That's what I'm trying to say. You understood me well enough to know that fear would make it worse, so you absorbed the fear yourself and dealt with it alone and got me through it. You did that hundreds of times, thousands of small versions of that." He paused. "I don't have a word for what that is. I've been trying to find one for 3 months, and I don't have one." The kettle started to sound. She turned and lifted it and poured, and her hands were steady, and he watched her make the tea with the same attention he'd once been incapable of giving her and was now constitutionally unable to withhold. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from him. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "That's not why I'm here. I want you to know that clearly." "I know that," she said. "I'm here because I owe you something I can't pay, and I needed you to see that I know that." He looked at her directly. "I was a man who had something extraordinary and spent 22 years treating it like furniture. And I'm not going to ask you to forgive that because I'm not sure it's forgivable, and I'm not sure forgiveness is what this needs." Elena looked at her teacup. Her thumb moved along the edge of it in a small, slow gesture he recognized from 2 decades of knowing her hands. "Roman," she said. "Yeah." She looked up. Her eyes were steady, not tearful, not cold, just steady, with something in them that had the quality of something hard-won, arrived at through a considerable amount of private work. I know who you were, she said. I always knew. I didn't stay because I was blind to it. I stayed because, for a long time, I believed the version of you that existed underneath that was worth staying for. And now? He said. Now, she said slowly, I think the version of you that exists underneath that is finally having to live out in the open, without me there to absorb everything it cost. She wasn't cruel when she said it. That was the thing about Elena that had always been the thing about Elena. She had a precision that landed like a scalpel, not designed to hurt, designed to cut accurately to the actual tissue. He felt it, the way you feel a scalpel, clean and exact and significant. Yes, he said. That's right. They sat with that for a moment. I'm going to step down from the organization, he said. Not immediately. The transition has to be done right, and I'm doing it right this time. But within the year. The legitimate business. I'll keep a role there. The rest, it goes to people who can actually carry it without it killing them. Elena looked at him. This seemed to reach her differently than what he'd said before. Why? She said. Because I've been building something for 30 years that I thought was power, he said. And it turns out it was just the thing I was doing instead of being honest about how much I needed help. And that's not something I want to keep building. The afternoon light had shifted while they sat there. It came through the balcony door at a different angle now, catching the edge of the table between them, the 2 cups of tea. One of Elena's plants on the balcony moved in a small wind that came through the open door. I want to ask you something, he said, and I need you to know you can say no, and I'll accept that. She waited. The documentation you've been maintaining, he said, the notes you're still keeping. I want to know if you'd be willing to work with Patricia Holt, the coordinator Diane brought in, to transfer that knowledge. Not permanently, not a return to what it was, just a transition. So the institutional knowledge gets to someone who can use it properly. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Patricia Holt, she said. You know her? Of her, she has a good reputation. A pause. She's going to struggle with the cardiac autonomic interaction piece. It's subtle, and Okonkwo has a specific approach that takes time to understand. That's what I thought, Roman said. Another pause. Elena looked at her tea. Then she looked at the balcony. Then she looked at him. 6 sessions, she said, with Patricia Holt to transfer the protocol context. That's what I'm offering. After that, she's on her own, and so are you. That's more than I had any right to ask for, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. He nodded. He looked down at his hands again. The conversation had the feeling of something arriving at its natural end. Not a bad end, not a good one in the simple sense, but a true one. The kind of ending that real things have, where nothing is completely resolved but the essential honesty has been achieved, and that has to be enough. He stood. He picked up his teacup and brought it to her sink. He wasn't sure why. Habit, maybe. Or the beginning of something. He turned from the sink and she was still sitting at the table looking at him, and he thought about March, about the conference room, about the gray dress and the pen, and the moment when he'd said he didn't need anyone anymore, and what had walked out the door in the wake of those words. You're going to be all right, she said. Not a question, not reassurance. A simple, direct statement of what she believed, from a woman who had spent 22 years tracking the evidence more carefully than anyone. I know, he said. And then, because it was true, and because he'd run out of reasons not to say true things, because you made sure of it, for longer than I deserved. Elena looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not forgiveness exactly, not the softening of a wound. Something more complicated. The particular expression of someone who has done an enormous amount of private reckoning and arrived at a place that isn't happiness and isn't bitterness, but is something quieter and more durable than either. Take care of yourself, Roman, she said. Actually, this time. I will, he said. He went to the door, he opened it. He stood for just a moment in the threshold. Then he walked out into the hallway, and the door closed behind him, and he stood alone in the quiet of the 3rd-floor corridor and breathed. Once. Twice. Then he walked to the stairs and went down. Outside, the street was doing what streets do in late August in Chicago, alive and ordinary and completely indifferent to the specific weight of what had just happened in a 3rd-floor apartment 100 feet above it. Roman walked to the car. He got in. He sat in the passenger seat and didn't say anything, and Marco, to his eternal credit, didn't ask. They drove north. The lake came into view when they crossed Michigan Avenue, the way it always did, sudden, enormous, going all the way to the horizon and then past it, a body of water so large it had its own weather. Roman looked at it the way he'd been looking at it since March, which was differently than he'd looked at it before. The way you look at things when you've recently learned how much you weren't seeing. His phone was in his pocket. He didn't check it. In her apartment in Wicker Park, Elena sat at the kitchen table for a while after he left. She finished her tea. She looked at the balcony, at the plants doing their quiet work in the afternoon sun, leaves moving in a small wind that came off the lake 3 miles east. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Holt's office. She left a message saying she was available to schedule the knowledge transfer sessions at the coordinator's convenience. Then she went to the balcony. She deadheaded a flower on the plant nearest the door, the one that had been blooming longest and was beginning to go past its peak. She did it carefully, pinching the spent bloom between 2 fingers, clearing the way for what was still growing underneath. Roman DeLuca stepped down from the DeLuca organization 11 months later, on a cold morning in July, in a transfer of authority that was handled quietly and completely and without incident. The legitimate businesses, the properties, the restaurant group, the import operation that had become genuinely profitable on its own terms, he retained a board position in. The rest he let go, the way you let go of a thing you've been carrying for so long that your hands have shaped themselves around it, and releasing it requires reshaping your hands. He moved into a smaller place. Still Chicago, still near the lake. He saw Dr. Yates every 6 weeks and Dr. Okonkwo twice a year in Houston, and Patricia Holt ran his medical coordination with a competence that had deepened considerably after 6 sessions with a woman who knew more about Roman DeLuca's body than Roman DeLuca had ever known about it himself. He kept the journal on his nightstand. He didn't need it the way he'd needed it in those first weeks. He kept it because it was the most honest document he'd ever held in his hands, and because there were still mornings when he needed to be reminded of what invisible devotion actually looked like, so he wouldn't make the mistake of missing it again. He and Sophia talked every Sunday. Real conversations. He asked about her work and listened to the answers. She told him about a man she was seeing, a surgical resident named David, who made her laugh. And Roman listened to the way her voice changed when she talked about him, and thought that Elena would like this story when Sophia told it to her. He didn't see Elena again, not in any sustained way. They passed through the same space twice in the following year, once at Sophia's hospital's annual dinner, where they sat at different tables and acknowledged each other with the particular calibrated courtesy of people who have said the important things and don't need to keep saying them. Once in Dr. Reeves' waiting room, by chance, where they sat together for 12 minutes and talked about Sophia and the weather and a restaurant on Dearborn that had recently opened. And it was the most ordinary conversation he'd had in years. And he understood, sitting there, that ordinariness was its own kind of gift, and that he had not always known that. Elena Marlowe, in her small apartment in Wicker Park, grew her plants and worked her clinic shifts and learned, slowly and in increments, what it felt like to live at a pace determined by her own needs, rather than by the emergency of someone else's survival. It was not dramatic, the life she was building. It did not have the intensity of the life she'd left. Some nights she sat on her balcony in the city dark and felt the specific absence of urgency as a thing with texture and weight. Not emptiness, but space. Room for something else, when she was ready. She was in no hurry. She had learned enough about time to know that it moved whether you were ready for it or not, and that the wisest thing you could do was be honest about where you were in it. On a Tuesday morning in the following spring, Roman sat by the window of his smaller apartment with the early light coming off the lake, and his medications taken and his blood pressure acceptable, and the journal closed on the table beside him. And he looked out at the city he'd spent 30 years trying to own and thought about a woman who had spent 22 years keeping him alive in it. He didn't call. He didn't need to. He understood now that gratitude didn't always require a recipient, that some of what he carried was simply the weight of knowing, and that the knowing itself was the point. That was the thing the journal had given him that no apology could have replaced. Not absolution, but clarity. The specific, costly, irreplaceable clarity of understanding what you had when you had it. The lake moved the way it always moved. The light came the way it always came. Chicago did what Chicago does. Roman DeLuca sat in the quiet of a morning he had done nothing to deserve and everything to maintain, and he breathed and he was, for the first time in as long as he could remember, simply and entirely present in his own life. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, as it turned out,